Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Hell's Kitchen Head Chefs Only following episode 5, which ended up being a non-elimination episode. And while there were some interesting things that happened across this episode, admittedly my thoughts on these people haven't changed too much from last week, but we'll still go through the ranking regardless. But we have 13 people to talk about, and so wasting more time, let's go into the video. So starting off at number 13, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on in the season is Anne-Marie. And this was obviously a change from last week where Amie was not at the bottom last week. However, I feel like that person had a better episode compared to Anne-Marie. And on top of that, I feel like Anne-Marie is pretty clearly the weakest link on the red team at this point, where we saw across this episode that she did pretty poorly across the challenge, losing the point there. And while their service here was fine for the most part, where they did pretty well with Magali and the meat station, I feel like their services before that weren't too impressive. And I feel like at the next opportunity, Anne-Marie's clearly the next person to go from the red team, if I had to guess. Though obviously you'll have to see how that pans out. And even beyond that, I feel like she's not really being set up for future storylines. I feel like there's not really much to really prop up with Anne-Marie. So for that reason, I do have her here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have another person who I'm not feeling the greatest about, and here we have Amanda. And Amanda's kind of a similar story where she does pretty poorly in the challenge, and while her service itself isn't too bad, I feel like she's probably one of the more under-edited people across the season. And unlike certain other people who haven't gotten the most content in the world, I feel like Amanda's is pretty clearly lacking a storyline, which I think separates her from some of these other people who people claim are under-edited. And through that, I feel like Amanda is probably another person who I'm not feeling the greatest about at this point, where really her only content in this episode is her talking about the reward, which is kind of nothing there. So I feel like Amanda is someone who I'm not looking too highly on, which is why she's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have the person who was at the bottom of last week's ranking, but we do have Egypt. And Egypt was pretty much the star of the show this episode, getting tons of content really across the entire episode, where obviously we get his perspective early on about him getting pretty upset over being put up once again and not really being liked by his team. You have him doing all right in the challenge, but following that, you have him getting upset during the punishment. You have him almost quitting the game only for Ramsay to talk him out of it, and then having a fine enough service at the end of the day. So in a lot of ways, you could see this as a potential turning point for Egypt, where this could be the point where he starts to turn things around, start to become a more likable presence from his team, and become a more capable leader for his team. Or on the other hand, like the fact that he wanted to quit the game could also be like this big red flag in Ramsay's eyes that could eventually lead to him being taken out, due to him not wanting it as much as other people there. So it's kind of a mixed bag over whether this is truly good content for Egypt, but it's still definitely something to point out, where Egypt is obviously this big character and someone who definitely cares about his family, as we saw across this episode. It's just a question of whether him wanting to quit will basically scar him in Ramsay's eyes from actually being the winner, someone who was willing to give up at the end of the day. So again, not really sure what to make of this, but it's at least positive content. It's at least a decent storyline for him moving forward if he's able to turn it around. So that was right, did move him up a couple spots, but at the end of the day, I'm still feeling not great about his overall trajectory, which is why he's here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have someone who admittedly I don't think is likely to win, but this was at least a fine episode for them. But we do have Magali, and this was a fine episode for Magali, where she does pretty well in the challenge, does pretty well in the service, nothing too shabby there. But at the end of the day, I feel like she's someone who is also kind of on the weaker side compared to the other people on the red team. Someone who I could definitely see being put up again if the red team were to lose another service. But I do think she at least has more set it to a storyline where, again, the fact that she got all that personal content after being put up was at least something to note out here. Then also this being a better episode for her performance-wise was enough to move her up a couple spots, but she's still not someone I'm looking at as a contender at this point, which is why she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and essentially these next couple people all went up slightly, but not to the point where they're really surpassing each other. But number 9, we do have Britney, and this was a fine episode for Britney here, where the bulk of her content comes during the reward, talking about how she was a bowler in high school, and having people talk about how that's pretty cool, that Britney's done all these great things. And again, it's at least some personal content there. I'm not sure if it's necessarily going to prop up Britney too much, considering like how unnecessarily she really was, considering that they just so happened to be on the reward there, where I feel like it would have been more effective if the rest team had lost the challenge and Britney still got to talk about being upset about not being able to bowl. So again, there's that at least. And beyond that, the service itself was fine. I feel like this episode didn't really move the needle for me when it comes to Britney. And while I think there's definitely potential for her to become this bigger character later, I feel like mixing her overall storyline in with her performance across the season, which has not been the greatest in the world, was not really enough to really move her up too much to where she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who's also remaining around the same spot, and here we have Joe. And you could argue that this was a good episode for Joe in the sense that he definitely got a visibility spike here. He got a lot of focus about his family when he's talking to Egypt about Egypt potentially wanting to quit the game. And then you obviously have him kind of making a mistake during the service where he screws up the sliders and is pretty slow to communicate with his team, only for him to turn it around later. So obviously he does get some good content here where we get to learn more about him, but it's also not great in the sense that he is one of the few people to make a mistake during what is otherwise a pretty good service. So I still feel like Joe is kind of in a precarious spot on his team, sort of alongside Egypt here. But the fact that he at least got somewhat decent personal content talking about his family again, which is something he did touch upon in the premiere, was enough to keep him around the same spot this week at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another person who's remaining around the same spot as last week, but we do have Brandon. And Brandon's someone who I think is a step above Britney and Joe in the sense that they are objectively performing better across services compared to them, where so far he's been presented as being a pretty competent chef, which I think is a massive praise to give him there. And he did get some good content here, talking about how he felt pretty confident during the challenge. He ends up getting the point over Amie. And then later on, he has his confessional when Egypt is wanting to quit the game about how he can relate to Egypt due to him missing his fiance. But at the end of the day, Egypt is simply not vibing with the rest of the team, which could be negative content if Egypt does end up having this massive turnaround, as it could set up this rivalry between Brandon and Egypt, where Brandon sees Egypt as being like this pretty loud person, but also could be good if Egypt just continues down his path about being overbearing and stuff, and him like wanting to quit is just more evidence for that. So again, I feel like it's content that could go either way, but really it's the fact that Brandon has performed consistently well across the services that is sort of keeping him this high on the list, though beyond that, I feel like the other people have more set up to do well and be future contenders, which is why Brandon is still here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and it is the same top 6 as last week. What a shocker. And it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 6, we still have Hannah. And again, this was kind of a fun episode for Hannah. Has a good service, is shown making a good dish. Beyond that, her only confessional comes during the service where she's worried about Amie and Magali, only for her to be proven wrong, which could be a negative there as she's shown being in the wrong in that situation. But I feel like at the end of the day, I feel like this episode wasn't really enough to lower my view of Hannah. I feel like she still performed pretty well, which is why she's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have another person who I feel about the same compared to last week, and here we have Megan. And Megan had an interesting episode here where she got a lot of focus during the challenge, talking about where she came from, like they make good burgers, and that her chicken burger will blow their minds, and sure enough, she ends up getting the point there, which is all pretty good there. And I feel like beyond that, you also have her comforting Kyle after Kyle lost a challenge for his team. You have her propping up Britney during the reward and talking about how fascinated she is by Britney. And while her and Whit are not on the same page during the service where she's complaining about Whit not really communicating with her, I feel like they were able to turn it around by the end of it. And I know I've heard some people say that they feel like Megan is barely on the show and that they feel like Megan's the next to go. I don't really see it that way. I don't think Megan's really that under-edited at the end of the day. I feel like she does get pretty positive content if you ask me. And I feel like this episode was definitely her getting more focus than she got in previous episodes. But I feel like beyond that, I feel like my view of her hasn't really changed all that much, where she's still shown being a mostly consistent performer. And at the end of the day, I feel like she's still one of these top contenders, which is why she's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I did change the order here compared to last week. I feel like one person had a better episode here compared to the others, and that is Lulu, who I did move down a spot compared to last week. Not so much because her episode here was bad, but more so because I felt like someone else had a better episode. Though if we are looking at Lulu, she does do pretty poorly in the challenge, which is obviously not the greatest look in the world, but beyond that, she does all right in the actual service. She talks about how Joe needs to step up, and while Joe does make a mistake, he does eventually turn it around. So admittedly, it's not the worst episode in the world. I mean, while she does pretty poorly in the challenge, I don't really factor challenge performances that much into my assessment of players. It's more so the actual service. And I feel like with Lulu still being one of the more vocal leaders in the blue team, I feel like I still have to have her here relatively high at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have someone who did move up slightly from last week, and here we have Kyle. And on paper, this was not the greatest episode for Kyle, where he obviously does pretty poorly in the challenge, where despite him volunteering to make 2 burgers for the challenge, he ends up losing on both of his matchups, which is obviously not great from a performance standpoint. But I think this episode also confirmed to me that Kyle is seen as his main character and someone who is probably going to be a contender here, where the episode really focuses a lot on their reaction to losing the challenge, how they feel bad, how they feel like that this isn't who they are and that they need to step up and that they need to make Ramsey proud. And then we do see him turning it around in the actual service, where he does pretty well in the actual service there, which is all pretty good. I feel like this episode just really confirmed to me that Kyle is someone we're supposed to be looking out for, someone who we are supposed to be rooting for. And while you could debate over whether this will actually lead to a win or if Kyle will just be like this fan favorite, I feel like the fact that Kyle got the treatment that they did after losing the challenge, after having a bad performance in the challenge, only confirms to me that they are going to be in it for the long haul. And obviously that's a pretty good sign for them, which is why he's still here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and it is the same top 2 as last week. And believe it or not, it is the same order. By number 2, we do have Whit. Now, obviously, this was a bit of a shaky episode for Whit from a performance standpoint, where we see them struggling during the service, where they're struggling to communicate. We even have Ramsey pulling them aside and accusing them of being disengaged, which is obviously not a great look, though Whit is able to turn it around relatively quickly, and we get plenty of her perspective on this, talking about how she is frustrated and angry, and that's why she is emotional, and how one mistake can drag the whole line down. And the fact that she's able to turn it around relatively quickly is a pretty good sign there. And I feel like beyond that, sort of similar to Kyle, I feel like Whit is clearly someone that we're meant to be rooting for, someone who is clearly meant to be shown as a competent chef, and someone who, even when they stumble, we see their perspective and how they're able to turn it around by the end of it. I feel like Whit is another person who I'm feeling pretty confident about at this point, considering the way that they're being presented on the show, considering their performance across the actual season. But I still have the same person in the top spot as last week, which is why I still have her here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Hell's Kitchen, head chefs only at this point, is still Anthony. And I know that Anthony is someone who hasn't gotten the most content in the world. However, this episode was definitely a visibility spike for them, where we once again see them checking up on Egypt, where it seems like that seems to be a major focal point in his content on the show, his relationship with Egypt, and definitely being one of the more sympathetic people when it comes to Egypt, due to him understanding how much that Egypt seems to want it. And beyond that, I feel like he does pretty well in this episode, doing well in the challenge, doing well in the service here. And as I said last week, I feel like Anthony is meant to be like the surrogate for the audience, where wherever the show seems to be going, it seems like we get Anthony's perspective on it. When the blue team does poorly, we see Anthony talking about how the blue team is struggling without really name calling anyone. When in this episode, we see us supposed to be sympathizing with Egypt over his struggles here, we see Anthony vocalizing that, talking about how Egypt is this passionate person, but there's this whole misunderstanding between Egypt and the rest of the team. And if Egypt is able to turn it around, if this is truly the start of Egypt starting to be someone who is able to relate better to his team, then I think that'll make Anthony look pretty good as well, considering that Anthony is vocalizing that. So I still feel like this episode confirmed to me that Anthony is someone who's meant to represent what the audience is doing. He's supposed to be like the narrator of the season. And while I could be ultimately wrong about that, I feel like Anthony is still someone who has kind of confirmed what I felt about him coming into it, which is why he's still here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you liked this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the Power Rankings again, so you can look forward to that. And I'm doing the Weird Cap streams on Thursday nights, so you can look forward to that as well. I'm continuing to Survivor Power Rankings, so you can expect weekly content on that show as well. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.